you remember the group Aha, Take On Me? You remember from Norway, Take On Me, Take Me On. It was this group.
All right, buckle up. This podcast is going to be a fun ride. We're going to be talking about electrical vehicles, solar power, environmental, lots of good stuff like that. But you know, when I was a young kid in my early 20s, back in the 1990s, if you can remember back that far, if some of you were even alive then, I drove a Dodge Omni. A Dodge Omni was a very efficient car. It was a compact hatchback car, if you can visualize that. Roll up windows, stick shift, had a tape cassette in it as well. I was driving that from Ontario to New Brunswick, which was about a 12-hour drive, and I was near the end of the drive in one of those, driver trances, if you want to call it that, where you can't remember the last 2 hours at all. And I'm thinking, how in the world do people get through those? How do we stay on the road when we're like that?
Right.
You've all been there, trust me. Okay, don't lie, you've been there. Anyways, I was woken up from that trance by the engine stopping, and I knew right away what that was. I was out of gas. I was supposed to gas up 2 hours ago, and I was almost at my destination. So I'm crawling down the Trans-Canada Highway. To make matters worse, I was actually going up a hill, but I managed to crest the top of the hill and coast down the hill all the way to an Irving gas station. And thank you, Mr. Irving, for putting your gas station there, because you saved my not my life, but you saved me from a lot of turmoil. Anyways, I'm telling you all that because at that time I had these thoughts. I thought, why don't we have a vehicle where we don't even have to gas up, where we don't have to put this shit in our car that stinks, it pollutes the environment? Why can't we have something that recharges itself as we drive, like from the sun? What if it can be electric? What if we could do that? What if it could recharge from the wheels moving or the brakes and stuff like that? So I had that thought, but no technology at that particular time. But fast forward to 2024, most of that is available to us today or is being perfected for us to use now. And we're going to talk a little bit about that today in this podcast. And if you didn't know it by now, you are watching the City DNA podcast, The People in Our Neighborhood. This is the podcast where we talk with local people who we find interesting, and there is nobody more interesting than our guest today. He is a personal friend of mine. He is an EV connoisseur, an environmental lover. He is an actor, a teacher, a husband, a father. He is the man that everybody wants to be, Mr. John Watson. John, what's going on?
I'm reeling from your introduction is what's going on there. That's hilarious.
Tell me that's not happened to everybody that's listening, run out of gas at one
My
point in their life.
brother, yeah, my brother and sister going, really, who the hell are you talking about? Yeah. It's going great, man. And I'm really, really pleased to be here. And yeah, that's a great story. Holy cow. How old were you when that happened, when you were
I was
cacking out of gas?
in the 90s. I was actually, let's see, I was in my early 20s. Actually, I might have been only 20 years old.
Yeah.
I think I was 20 years old, 1993 or 4.
That's funny. I'm so glad you told that story because you know what? It actually brought me back to something I had blanked out on because I was like, well, what was my first car? And mine was also, it was the really small original Honda. Like I'm clearly older than you, so this is like way before that. It was a Honda CVCC.
Oh, wow.
And it was the original, like basically it's the size of like a Honda Fit today. And they had quality problems back then. It was kind of like what the early Hyundai Ponies were like, and perhaps some of the early Chinese product were like, which is not an issue now because they're really getting quality, and so the quality eventually came in. But I remember having problems with the motor, and I remember being on a trip, and I can't remember where I was coming from, but the piston rings were going, the head was like warping out. So it was burning oil. And every time I was going up a hill, like on the highway, it was like spewing black. Oh, it was bad. It was like I was coal rolling people and I didn't intend to. So it's just hilarious for me to think now back to that's where we were back in
Yeah.
the 80s.
Well, that's actually a good kind of introduction too, because it reminds me of that same car where, many times I've did that trip from Ontario to New Brunswick and back. And
Mhm.
there's been many times I've been on the side of the highway, in the middle of the winter, and all
Yeah,
is that's around our farm fields. And I remember walking through 3 feet of snow to a farmhouse because my car had stopped.
yeah,
And of course, they don't speak English there. And where that was, it's like they definitely don't speak English. It's like pure
right,
French.
right.
And the guy told me to put water on the top of my, I forget what it's called now. See, we don't have to deal with these problems, is my point, though. We don't have to
Yeah,
deal with engine problems as much as we did back then.
it was a thing, man. Yeah, in the 50s, like 50s, 60s, 70s, it was just kind of like, oh yeah, you had a boil over. Like what? Yeah, your
What's
radiator
that?
boiled over.
Yeah, yeah, exactly. And, and so that brings me to EV cars,
Yeah,
where there's none of that. There's hardly any moving parts in that.
no,
What a great idea. Wonder who came up
yeah,
with
it's
that idea.
amazing. Who came up with it? Do you want to know how early? Hey, this is
Actually,
what
I'd
I
like to. I'd like to know if you know the history. I'd like to know because I think I know, but I'm probably wrong.
go for it. Well, you tell me what you think, and it's okay to be wrong.
Well, now I
I'm
know
not
I'm wrong.
surprised.
Well, so we all know the modern day part where Elon Musk has made his cars.
Sure.
Obviously, that it's not. He just didn't wake up one day and said, "Oh
Yeah.
my God, let's do this." Um, I think it came from Tesla days back when what's his first name?
Oh, when Nikola Tesla himself.
Nikola Tesla. Yeah, I think it
Yeah.
came from him somehow. I
Yeah.
don't know, but I know that there used to be electric cars way back then, but for
Yeah.
some reason they just stopped making them.
Yep. So it was way back even before you even thought and before I even thought. I was
Really?
1832.
Holy shnikes!
1832. So literally like horseless carriage. It was like a carriage, and let's get rid of the horse and let's take the front bits off and let's put a small motor on it and a battery. And the battery was actually made of, it was a crude oil battery, so it was not rechargeable, it wasn't reusable. And this was in Scotland. I've forgotten the gentleman's name right now, but that was the first one that they have. There were a number of spots. It was kind of like back in the day when they were trying to get the first flying machine. And everyone was trying it all around the world in different spots. And then finally, the Wright brothers got the first, sustained flight. There were a number of places in Scandinavia, in Germany, in Holland, and there was a gentleman in Scotland who was the first one who created a horseless carriage that was then it was shown at an exposition. Fast forward probably about 30 or 40 years, and we start getting rechargeable batteries. And then by the late 1800s, so just around the turn of the century, that's when we had this really interesting situation where in New York City, you literally had steam powered cars, you had ICE cars, internal combustion engine, you had electric. And so it was about 40% electric and then 30-30 for the other pair. The
Really?
steam cars were a little cleaner, but you had to, took 30 minutes to steam it up. You had to heat up the boiler to get it going. The electric cars were amazing because you didn't have to hand crank them. So you have to remember back then you used to have to hand crank to get an old car going.
Yeah.
And so they were actually at the time sort of sold as comfortable cars for women because if you were a rich woman from a rich household, you could plug it in at home and then take it out driving around the city, and there were none of the fumes. And the main thing was there was no sort of arm braking cranking.
Right.
Eventually, ironically, it was actually the electric motor, the electric starting motor, that killed the electric car because then it made it easy to start it. But there were a couple of things that really tipped it. One of the big things was Henry Ford, and Henry Ford creating the assembly line. So he put all of his eggs into the ICE, into the internal combustion basket, and no one could keep up with that. And it got to the
Right.
point where the cost got driven so low, it was one third the price of an electric car. So that was
Wow.
a huge factor. The second big factor was that they found stupid cheap and easily available oil in Pennsylvania, hence Penn State oil, right? It's kind of
Okay.
weird. We don't think of it nowadays. And Texas, of course. But the biggest thing was the First World War. And so you literally had to figure out how are we going to get the boys to the front line and how are we going to get our boys home. And if you were depending on electric troop carriers, electric tanks, you got to be able to charge them. And if the enemy
Yeah.
took out one of your lines, you're gone.
Done.
Whereas you could bring barrels of diesel, you could bring barrels of petroleum around with you. And so that was kind of the death knell at that point between those three things. So it went into this slumber for probably about 50 or 60 years. We see occasionally in the 50s, 60s, and 70s some of those really crazy sort of hippie cars that are almost like a golf cart with like a metal shell on the outside. And then one of the really cool things, you remember this guy, you remember the group Aha, Take On Me? Remember from
No.
Norway, Take On Me, Take Me On. It was this great
No.
song back in the 80s. Anyway, the guy's name is Morten Harket. And the guys from this group, Aha, in Norway, and any women especially who were teenagers back in the 80s will certainly know who Morten Harket is. He looks like Patrick Swayze. He's like Norway's answer to Patrick Swayze. These guys got things started in Norway because a friend of theirs brought them to a conference in Switzerland back in probably the late 80s. So when electric cars were absolutely not a thing, but at this conference, this environment conference, which was also kind of not really a thing back then,
Hmm.
they saw this Fiat Panda, which had been retrofitted into an electric car with like batteries underneath the seats and stuff. And they're just like, this is amazing. And they bought one and brought it back to Norway with them and said, we want to make Norway an electric vehicle country. And so what they did is they started this whole publicity campaign where they drove this thing around Oslo and all around Norway, and they would park it and then go, we should have free parking for electric cars. And it would get ticketed, and they go, we're not going to pay the ticket. And they would drive in the bus lane, and they would say, we're not going to pay the toll and stuff like that. So they would keep getting tickets all the time on this Panda. And eventually it got, they eventually grabbed the car. You know, the authorities said, okay, we're going to impound it. And so then they have these impounded cars, and then they're like, okay, what are we going to do with it? We're going to have to auction it off. Well, no one else wanted it, so then they bought it again at auction and then repeat. And they did this like 4 times until finally the government went, okay, fine, uncle,
Yeah.
because it was such an amazing publicity stunt that they actually got exactly that, like free parking, free access to commuter lanes, free ferries, and no import taxes on it. And the import taxes are pretty high. Fast forward to last year, 2023, and 90% of cars in Norway that were sold were battery electric vehicles.
Oh, wow. I didn't know that.
Unbelievable, 90%. So they are so far out in front, and they really are showing us a way to go. You need to put those price levers in. You need to put those kinds of incentives in. So
Yeah.
I think that it's extraordinarily important. And we're starting to see that depending on what jurisdiction you're in. If you're in British Columbia, if you're in Quebec, they're way out in front. It's
Hmm.
no surprise because they've got the provincial incentives as well. So,
Right. Yeah.
um,
That's
yeah,
interesting. Like, especially being in Norway where it's cold, because that's one of the things that people say, well, you can't have an electric car in the cold weather. It's not going to work right.
yeah,
So
exactly.
what are they doing different? Or is that even
Yeah, I
an
mean,
issue?
Norway is a beautiful test bed. It's like, I mean, Norway is kind of like, it's like Quebec, except not nearly as wide. It's like if you took a slice of Quebec,
Yeah.
that's kind of Norway, because like Oslo is very similar to Montreal, and then
Hmm.
it just goes up to the Arctic Circle.
Right.
And they've got electric vehicle chargers all over the place. The reality is that actually an electric vehicle, to drive it, the motor can go in like any temperature. The motor doesn't care. You
Yeah.
could be like minus 80 and the motor itself is fine. The only issue that you have is with the batteries. So the batteries, it's a chemical reaction, right? So a chemical reaction, any photographer would tell you that they take their film, and a lot of them will store their film in a refrigerator, or people will store batteries in a refrigerator to make them last a little bit longer. So it makes the reaction slow down. So you need to have battery management. You need to be able to warm the battery up. The
Right.
reality is, when I bought my car, 500 kilometers of range in it. I've
Hmm.
had it now. So I've done 6 winters in this car. I've done 210,000 kilometers. I've driven out to where you were from. We went out east. We went way into the boonies, like way off grid. There's never been a problem. I've never ever been white knuckling, going, I'm down at 3%, and I don't know if I'm
Yeah.
going to get a charge. Like, it's never happened, right? In
Yeah.
the
You'd be
wintertime,
planning that though too, right? Like, especially now when there's not as many charge stations as there will be
mhm,
in the future.
Hmm.
You have to plan. You're not going to go to Timmins, maybe. I don't know, maybe they have some stuff there,
They do.
but it's like, what happens if you do get stuck? So you do have to plan it a little bit,
Yeah.
but I envision in the future that there'll be one everywhere, right?
Yeah.
The gas stations we have today for gas
Yeah.
will have spots to charge our
Yeah.
electric vehicles. They have to.
Well, and it's a wholesale. This is the interesting thing, right? It's a completely different way of thinking. You have a different relationship with yourself and transportation and how you fuel transportation, right? Because unless you're at like a big depot or on a farm, you don't have a big tank of fuel, right? In those cases, they might have
Yeah.
their own fuel supply, but you don't have one sitting on your driveway.
Yeah.
So you're always thinking, your thinking is, oh, how many hundreds of kilometers have I got? Where am I going to get fuel? And for the most part, you don't think about that unless, let's say, I mean, I know I had this happen up in cottage country and it's a Sunday and the closest, gas station is closing at 6 p.m. and there isn't anything else around.
Yeah.
And it's going to be closed for the rest of the evening. So you have to, in those rare circumstances, as a cottager, you have to go, okay, make sure I gas up now because, it's going to be closed for the rest of the night kind of thing.
But
It's rare in the city.
but it's
Whereas
no
the
different.
reality for me as an electric vehicle driver, I could actually drive all the way to the cottage and I literally just plug into the exterior of the cottage with like a level 1 charger. I just plug in the
Yeah.
extension cord
Well, I was going to say
and
the
then
relationship
my
is
car's
different.
juicing up. It's a different relationship.
It's like
it's
our
like a
phone.
phone. It's like
Yeah.
your phone. And I say it's like you don't think about your phone in your normal work day. You plug it in at night, you take it
Yeah.
out in the morning, and maybe
It's
it goes down to
recharged.
70%, it goes to 30%, it goes to 50. If you've been using it a ton, you might plug it in at work. You know, the only time you think about it is if, let's say, you're a tourist and you're away from the hotel and you're shooting photos all the time and you're in Paris, or let's say you're on a canoe trip and you want to bring that because you want to take some photos or whatever. Now all of a sudden you're being thoughtful and you're going, okay, bring a power bank, and make sure I plug it in, or bring like a little, like I have a solar power bank, right?
Yeah.
So those are the only times. And it's the same thing with your electric vehicle. The only time you're thinking is when you're going long distance, right? And you're going, okay,
Yeah.
well, just take into account where I'm going to stop.
Yeah, exactly. I think, I don't have an electric vehicle myself, but my neighbor
Mhm.
does. So I get to, by the way, I think you taught me this. So it's a funny story. So he gets
Yeah,
his Tesla. He's had it for a couple of years now. But he
yeah,
didn't know anything about it other than that it's electric and he likes the
yeah,
looks of it and all that stuff. So he takes me for a ride, and he didn't know that I had already been in one before, which I believe was yours.
yeah.
And I just did a little adjustments on the dashboard there that I knew where these things were, these settings were. And every time he made a right turn, there was a fart sound. He had no idea. Every time he's like, "What's that? Is that
That's
you?"
funny.
And then
That's
he caught on
hilarious.
when I started laughing that I did something,
That's
and then
awesome.
I had to
Yeah, they
explain it.
built in all kinds of Easter eggs and silly fun
Elon
things for
Musk is
sure,
such
though.
a funny guy, man. He is a funny,
He's
funny dude.
he's a nut bar. He is.
Yeah.
I think he needs to stay off Twitter.
He owns it, bud. He
I
can say what he wants.
Yeah, I know.
He's
There you
hilarious,
go.
though. He really
I
does.
say
He's
I say to
funny.
people he's a visionary in the best and the worst sense of that
Yeah.
expression. So
Yeah.
it took a visionary to be that outrageous that he would push through all of the phenomenal things that happened to Tesla in its early days, and to get us to the point where it is now, where he had all the incumbents, all the OEMs running scared, and that's the reason. I think it's the reason we've got everyone now producing electric vehicles. Why the recent Toronto Auto Show, was so full of electric vehicles. But by the same token, he's also a visionary in
Yeah.
that sense, which is like difficult to live with, I would say.
Yeah.
Difficult to
Oh,
work
yeah.
for and
Yeah.
difficult to live with.
It's one of those things, though. Like he might say the strangest things, or stuff that gets him in trouble with the SEC or whatever it is.
Hmm.
But you gotta wonder, like, the guy's so smart. Is what he's saying true? Should I be listening to that? It's one of those things where, I wonder.
Well,
If you
yeah,
or
and
I
I've
went and
always
said those things, it wouldn't go the same way. Let's put it that way.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's a combination. He's clearly dealing with some interesting wiring and some very challenging upbringing, which has led to yeah, led to some emotional upset, and I think it comes out in the strangest ways. And I know from a lot of the work I've done with men, I do some great work with men here in town, and having trusted people who are close to you, that instead of putting stuff on loudspeaker and saying it out loud or tweeting
Hmm.
it, it's like,
Hmm.
give me a call, dude. Doesn't matter, 1 a.m., 2 a.m. Give me a call if you need to offload. Talk to me, and I'll give you some perspective, and then
Yeah.
we'll talk in the morning, and you'll kind of go, yeah, I'm really glad I didn't tweet that out. I
Yeah.
think he
True.
hasn't availed himself of that opportunity. He's probably surrounded by people who are afraid to say no to him,
Yeah.
and
You know what's funny
yeah.
though is I bet you he has a lot more things going on in his head than he actually says. You know what I
Mm,
mean? Like what we're hearing is the filtered version of him.
that's scary. Yeah, no, it's
Yeah.
true. I think it's true. Yeah, he is. He's scary smart, and
Yeah.
it took someone that outrageous to create what he did. But unfortunately, also, because I'm the EV guy and I talk to some people, there's some people who outright will not go for a Tesla
Hmm.
because he's been inextricably linked to the brand,
Hmm.
and they object so much to the things that he said. They're like, yeah, I hate the brand because I hate him, and they simply won't buy the car,
Yeah.
which is unfortunate.
Yeah, it's
It's
true. It's
unfortunate
unfortunate.
for
That I
the
mean,
brand.
people have the right to have their opinions and choose not to do things for various
Hmm.
reasons. You know,
Yeah,
that's it's unfortunate though because it is a good product and
yeah,
he's the
amazing.
leader of the industry and I think he'll be the leader of the industry forever. I hope he's not a BlackBerry. You know what I mean? Like BlackBerry,
Yeah.
wow, look at us, we're BlackBerry, and then now look at them.
Well, it's interesting you should say that because he even himself, like it's interesting. So BYD, I'm not sure if you're familiar with that brand,
I've heard of
BYD
it. Yeah,
from,
I haven't
yeah,
researched it much, but I've heard
it's
of
a
it.
slightly cheesy name. It's from China. It's called Build Your Dreams,
Hmm.
which is a strange name, but an amazing company. And it's interesting that Warren Buffett, who is of course the Oracle of Omaha, he bet on them 8 years ago. So he owns a
Yeah.
huge chunk of it. He bought a huge chunk back when it was a tiny little company. And they're interesting because they were an incumbent ICE maker, an internal combustion car company, but
Hmm.
then transitioned and they were making more sort of plug-in hybrids. And now they've got an extremely compelling number of fully electric vehicles. And sort of it's kind of like they went through what Hyundai did, only they did it, what it took Hyundai to do in 20 years, they did in like 2 years,
Yeah, that's
from
amazing.
questionable quality in the early days to instantly. And they now have, I think, what is it, the BYD Seagull or something like that. They're selling a lot, like in Southeast Asia, $15,000 US,
Wow, that's
fully
nuts.
electric, with all kinds of great little doodads in it and stuff. They're buying them up like crazy in Australia because they used to have a domestic auto industry in Australia, and they don't anymore. So now they're just like, okay, well, whatever, we'll take
Yeah,
whatever's
well, at
coming.
that price, of
And
course.
they have such incredible solar energy in Australia, of course, right? So
Hmm.
solar is going on everyone's roof. They're putting that on like it's nobody's business,
You
and
talking
they're
about their
moving over to
houses?
electric cars. Yeah, their houses, like
Yeah.
rooftop solar and massive battery storage. So that is moving really quickly in Australia, and EV adoption is finally happening. And they're similar-ish to Canada in that they're an extractive economy. They have been and still are pretty heavily addicted to coal for
Hmm.
electricity. There's a ton of mining there and that kind of thing. But this whole new energy transition, just because they have now that solar has been driven down, the price has been driven down so low, you'd be stupid. You'd be
Yeah.
stupid to make electricity any other way.
Let's
So
talk about that for a second, because I know that
mhm,
you've transitioned into the solar field as well. So you
yeah.
probably got a lot more knowledge on it than a lot of people.
Hmm.
Um, just going back to Elon Musk for a second, he
Hmm.
had those solar shingles.
Hmm.
And the whole idea is to build your house with these solar shingles, charge your EV car, and life would be great. But
Yep.
that we haven't really heard of that. Like, what's happened with that?
Yeah.
Is it on hold, or is there issues
It
with
was
the
unfortunate. It
panels?
was Solar City was the company.
Yeah.
It was owned by his cousins from South Africa, and he kind of got into business with them, and then kind of ran them out of town. It wasn't great. So there's another questionable thing that he did. And they were actually very successful. They were doing really well.
Before they
And
were,
now,
yeah.
who are they? What are they? Right? They were absorbed. They became part of Tesla. They created a factory, or they took over a factory in Buffalo, and that was meant to be their big whole sort of solar thing. I mean, it was looked like a really compelling product. I
Hmm.
was, wow, I would love that.
Yeah.
They've had tons of troubles with it. They kind of
Yeah.
they positioned over there like, we're still kind of working on it. And at the meantime, started selling, okay, we're going to have the Tesla solar, and we're selling regular panels. I don't think they were even making the panels. I think they were imported.
Mm.
So combination of two things, the regular panels, again, China is just so good at making them. They're responsible for driving the price down, which is great for all of us, but it also means that any domestic industry, the German panel makers, the
Yeah.
US one, they just can't compete. The only way that Biden and friends are competing is by creating sort of a gated, you know,
Yeah.
putting up all sorts of import duties and so on to try and stop that. So I think in Tesla's case, these roofing tiles, awesome idea. They're not ready for prime time yet,
Yeah.
unfortunately.
That's
So they're
unfortunate,
mostly
right?
putting panels on. Yeah.
Canadian Solar in right
Hmm.
here in Guelph.
Right here in Guelph.
They don't manufacture them here, do they? Or
They
are
sure
they?
used to. They did. I mean, again, this is yeah. We could get political here. So I found it I found it a little depressing. I've been listening to this amazing podcast. I know it's not nearly as amazing as City DNA, but it's called Green Energy Futures. Out of Edmonton, Alberta, of all places, you would kind of go, oh, Alberta, what a joke. Of course, it's like the oil patch, but Edmonton is kind of like this groovy little forward thinking. They're
Yeah.
like Austin, Texas, like they're this
Yeah.
groovy city in the middle of the oil patch. And so this podcast comes out of there, and I'm listening to all of the backlog of early episodes, and they're talking about the early days, like 10 years ago, when Ontario was so far out in front. That's when all the wind
Yeah.
turbines were getting in. That's when we
Yeah.
had solar microfit, where you could
Yeah.
put it on your roof and get paid. I mean, we were so far ahead. That's when I got my car. I got 14,000 back from the government, rebate from the provincial government. I got 1,000 for my charger that I put on my house. We were so far ahead. And then in 2018, in June, it was just
Boom.
like, boom, stop, close the door.
Why do you
And
think
all
that
of that
was?
stuff. Sorry?
Not to get too political, but why do you think that was? Why was there a stop?
Ford government, it was the Ford government,
But why would you
bottom
do
line.
that though? I don't understand.
Because I would say at the time, yeah, bottom line is people are averse to change. And I think like anything, there's a lot of lobby groups. I mean, they're politicians, so lobbyists get to come in.
Yeah.
And so any of the fossil fuel manufacturers, any people like Enbridge, it's happening right now, like in real time. We can talk about that as well. And the whole Enbridge thing, in fact, we should talk about that. I
Yeah.
mean, these guys have a lot of clout, and they're like, you know what? See that thing? You need to stop that. And so then the really cheesy way that they went about it was, oh, look, these are these expensive electric toys for rich boys, and you good working folks of
Yeah.
Ontario, you're subsidizing these rich people to play in their rich
Mm.
electric toys. It's like, no, this is how new technology works. It starts at the
Yeah.
top. You start with an expensive prototype, which is what the Tesla Roadster was, and then a slightly less expensive and more popular thing like the Model S and the Model X, still too expensive
Hmm.
for me. And
Hmm.
then finally, a compelling one, which is basically half the price again, the Model 3.
Yeah.
More expensive than I would normally spend, but within reach. I could make the stretch to it. And the
Yeah.
14,000 from the government was just enough to kind of
Make it affordable.
bridge the gap, just like what Norway did. This is what Norway did. They
Yeah.
basically shifted it so that then, for purely financial reasons, you go, okay, this is worth my while. And I think it played, like with any political thing, whoever owns the message manages to, you can bend it however you want, and they bent it
Yeah.
with going, hey, isn't this terrible? Look at all this money going to these rich people. It's like, no, it was a way of getting infrastructure. It was a way of breaking that cycle of the chicken and the egg. It's like, well,
Yeah.
why are we going to build infrastructure if there's no cars? Well, why are we going to put cars on the road if there's no infrastructure? It's like someone's got to show
Someone's got to
leadership.
do it. Yeah.
Yeah,
Absolutely.
and I mean, we as Canadians, we love to punish whoever was previously in government. I mean, the Liberals are in for long enough, and then they run afoul of whoever they get punished, they get thrown out. Then the Conservatives are in for X
Yeah.
amount of time, they run afoul of some sort of unwritten law, and then they get punished and they're out, you
Yeah.
know. But what's unfortunate is that what the baby that got thrown out with the bathwater was our green movement, and we were so
Yeah.
far ahead. We were making real moves, and then it just absolutely stopped. Like, and not just cars, but like greener home grants, all
Yeah.
kinds of stuff.
Yeah.
And so I think yeah, there's a lot of people, there's a lot of vested interest, there's a lot of people who are making a lot of money selling molecules to people. That's really what it comes down to now in 2024 is molecules are really good for stuff. Like if you want to buy things, you need to buy molecules. If you want to pull fossil fuels out of the ground, it's a really great feedstock to be used to make plastics and to make medicines, to make all kinds of things we need in industry. It's a useful set of molecules to make industrial things. To burn those fossil fuels in gas, coal, or oil just to get energy,
Not a
we
good
don't need to do
use.
it anymore.
Yeah.
It's passe. We actually don't have to do that. I know a number of people whose houses they literally had the meter cut off. They had the guys come and go cut off the meter. You know, you don't need anything other than a vibrating
Yeah.
electrons to move your car and to heat and light your house. You
Well,
don't
that's
need
kind
that.
of the thing. Like I sell real estate. To
Hmm.
me, it's a no-brainer that every house that's built should have a charger built into the garage, no matter what level it is, whether it's a condo or a mansion, it should
Yep.
be required,
Yep.
right? And that's
Yeah.
what prevents a lot of us from being able to purchase that. Like, I don't care what I drive. I don't care if it's
Hmm.
electric or gas. I just like what I drive because I'm used to it. I
Yeah.
drive a Ford Explorer. It uses a lot
Yeah.
of gas. I get it. But it's
Right.
very practical for my lifestyle with taking people to places. I can pull trailers with it. I can do a lot of stuff with it. And I like the
Hmm.
looks of it.
Sure.
Put it in EV, I'm sold.
Yeah.
But what's it going to cost me? 100 grand, 120? I
Hmm.
can't afford that. So I'm
Right.
driving mine till it dies.
Right.
You know what I mean? Hopefully, by the time mine dies, there's an alternative somehow,
Yeah,
and
and that's what
I'll
I
be
would
the
say to
first to
people
sign
is
up.
like if you're in an ICE car now, hang on to it and as long as you can. I guess that would be my only request of people, I guess, is not to buy a brand new internal combustion car in 2024. You
Yeah,
don't really need to. Like if you want to stay ICE, buy something used or buy, if you really have to buy a plug-in hybrid. But my big, like I've had this conversation a number of times with friends, and I've just said, hey, if I can sit down with you and your wife together at the same time, and we'll go on a Google Meet, and I'll start showing you maps. I'll show you maps of where all the chargers are. It's not like a Petrocan
yeah,
station where you're like, I know where the Petrocan is, right? It's right, it's like
yeah.
700 meters away around the
It's
corner.
at such and
They,
such a
there are
park.
actually there are actually chargers
Yeah,
all over the place,
yeah.
but
There's
they're small. You don't see them, so you use
no.
plug share, and then you know
Oh,
exactly where they are. And so you actually can, like I said, I've done 210,000 clicks, and I've never even come close to running out of
speaking
planning.
of Fords,
Hmm.
they just recently adopted Tesla's charger system or something.
That's
There's an
right.
adapter.
That's
I
right.
think that's pretty cool. What do you think about that? Is that a
Yeah,
good
that's
move?
really cool. So here's how it worked. I mean, in Europe, they had a thing called CCS2, Combined Charging System 2,
Hmm.
and then Tesla, of course, came out with their connectors. So there was Tesla and CCS, and then Europe being Europe, they're really great about this. They have no problem regulating stuff. They kind of go, listen, we want a functional society. A functional society is more important than everyone just doing their own thing, right? So CCS2 is the standard. That's what you're going to do, right? So then Tesla's like, oh, okay, all right. So when they introduced the Model 3, it came with the CCS2 port, which was the
Okay,
same as all the other cars that were being produced. And then they provided an adapter for their legacy Teslas, right? So they provided the adapter so that people with the
right.
normal Tesla thing could go
Yeah,
CCS2. So it's been like that in Europe since 2018. Everyone's playing by the same rules, same port,
yeah.
simple, simple. Over here, we had three. We had Chatamo, which was originally from Japan, and that was the Nissan Leaf, right?
Hmm.
So they had their own thing, and that came over to North America along with the Nissan Leaf, which is a very popular little car. You still see some of those old bubbly ones. It almost looks like an AMC Pacer. It's pretty
Yeah.
hilarious, like a miniature one. Um, and then CCS1 was the official standard. So that's the SAE, the standard, what is it called? Standards of Automotive Engineers, something like that. Society of Automotive Engineers standard, right? So they're like CCS2, that is going to be the standard. Meanwhile, Tesla had already been using theirs, and they're like, I don't know about you, but this is working great for us. And even though it was only one company, it was like 85% of the market.
Exactly. Yeah.
And so 15% of the market was using CCS2, although it made up all of the other manufacturers combined, which was like, 12 or 13 other manufacturers. Fast forward to the summer of 2022, Jane and I are out east, and I'm kind of going, yeah, it's probably just a matter of time before we have to go CCS2. Like, everything's going to increase, or CCS1, sorry. We're going to go combined charging system. I'll have to get an adapter. It's going to happen. I assume that's what was going to happen. About 5 months later, in November of 2022, doesn't our friend Elon Musk say, by the way, welcome to the North American charging standard. That is like Tesla. It's now the North American charging standard.
Yeah.
I declare it to be so.
Nice.
And I was just kind of like, well, that's a very Elon thing to say. And I was like, yeah, good luck with that. And then, but I was thinking, yeah, it'd be nice if it's true. Fast forward to May of 2023. And they've been lobbying in the background and going to all the various manufacturers and saying, hey, we know you like our charging network. Would you like on? If you come on board, you use our standard. We're going to open it up. Like, we're not going to throttle it. It's not going to be like Sony Betamax, where they're like, we're going to license it out and we're going to make money. It's just like, it's free.
It's free.
Please use it. Right?
It's nuts.
No, it's nuts. Good. So by May of 2023, Ford was like, yeah, we want on board. Like, there's just no contest. The Tesla supercharging network is so far in front of any of the other ones. And then GM, and then Mercedes, and then Hyundai. And then it was like these dominoes in the space of literally 4 weeks. All of the dominoes fell, with the exception of Volkswagen, who created Electrify America as their mea maxima culpa because of the Dieselgate. So you remember the whole Dieselgate thing with Volkswagen. Part of their reparations was to create Electrify America. So they're like, we don't want to come on board with Tesla's thing. But eventually they had to relent, because like, what are you going to do? You're going to be this like ridiculous little outlier, So it happened so quickly. We're now in this really weird transitional time where if you buy a Tesla, you're great. You're future forward. You will have no problems. If you buy any other car right now, it still has a CCS1 port in it, even though your manufacturer has already declared that they're on board with the other one. So they're going to provide an adapter for those drivers, for anyone who buys the car, any legacy cars or any that are made up until like the end of this year. But at some point before the end of this year, those manufacturers are going to start making their cars with the NACS port, North American Charging Standard, aka Tesla. They're going to make
That's so awesome.
So we're in this slightly bizarre 1 to 2 year kind of like wonky transition. But if you get yourself, if you want to get into an EV right now, I would say to people, probably buy yourself either a new Tesla or get a used one. Like, there's a ton of good used ones, especially if you go to Quebec, right? So Quebec is an amazing source for used EVs, because the prices have been driven down. The used prices have been driven down by the lowering of the new prices, which have been driven down by Tesla. And on top of that, in Quebec, they have the 5,000 federal plus 7,000 provincial. So people are getting 12,000 off of their ticket price. So as a result, the used market is very, very reasonable. So if you just went on Auto Trader in Montreal and said, what can I find? You'd be in great shape. You could get a really, really great car for, I don't know, somewhere between 20 and 30,000.
I was hoping you say 10.
Yeah, not yet. If BYD comes to Canada, look out. It's going to be.
Well, it wasn't too long ago when you could buy a car for 10 grand. Maybe 20 years. Well, maybe not. 20 years ago.
Car?
Yeah. I was thinking What did I
Well,
pay?
I
Yeah.
had the most basic, like the most popular Canadian car, Honda Civic. So I got a basic Honda Civic in 2012, and that was about 21,000. Bottom, I
So
would have said.
why do you think electric vehicles cost so much? It seems like they should be cheaper because there's not a lot in them. There's
Yeah,
less moving
the
parts. So what's going on with that?
yeah, that's a great question. It's the battery, right? So when I bought my car, the battery alone was 40% of the price of the car. Okay, that's come down already a lot. So batteries are doing the same thing that solar panels are
Solar, yeah.
doing, and the same thing as about Moore's law regarding computer chips, right? So Moore's law says that every 18 months, a computer chip gets half as expensive and twice as
Twice as
fast,
fast. Yeah.
right? For solar, I think it's for every doubling of the solar capacity in the entire world, the price drops by 25%, something like that.
Yeah.
And with batteries, I'm not sure what that one is, but we can look that up later on. But we are now below the magic number. The magic number of parity was $100 US per kilowatt hour of battery space. And I think we're now down at like $75 or something like that. Like it's going like that. Cheaper. Yeah,
Yeah.
for sure.
So that actually brings me to the question that I wanted to ask a while ago.
Hmm.
So I get all of the benefits of being on electric and,
Hmm.
the noise and no pollution, all that stuff.
Hmm.
One of the things that I hear a lot about, and I have zero knowledge on it, is
Hmm.
how do we dispose of these batteries and how long do they last before we
Hmm.
have to dispose of them?
Yeah.
Do you know what the process
Yeah,
is? And
I love that you said how long do we have them until they're gone, right? So there's what we call embedded carbon, right? So when a if you were to compare a regular ICE car and let's say a regular um, battery electric vehicle, let's say they both have the same amount of embedded carbon in the body. That's how much carbon was used up making the
to make
steel,
it, yeah.
bending it, doing all that kind
Yeah.
of stuff. So let's say that those are equal, and then a battery comes with an extra embedded carbon, amount for the battery itself,
Right.
right? So when it rolls off the line, it has more of a carbon deficit, if you will.
Yep.
Now, if you are in the smelliest, most coal burning state in the United States, and I'm going to say the U.S. because there's no provinces like that in Canada. We have a pretty clean grid up here, right?
Hmm.
So even if you're in the most coal burning state, it still uses less carbon. This is a classic myth. People go, oh, if you're plugging it in, then you're burning it in carbon. It's still more efficient. It's still way better. It would take you 5 years. So 5 years in an entirely coal burning state,
Hmm.
5 years you would be at parity for the
Right.
coal burning.
And then how long does it last
In
beyond that?
Canada, it's 1 year, and the battery
Wow.
itself. So this is the thing. So I'm 6 years in my car, and I'm already at 210,000 kilometers. This way ahead. Like I'm probably had about 10 years of car use because it's the only car we use. The ICE
Yeah.
car stays in the driveway. Anytime someone has to drive a distance, that's the car they take, right? So um, when this car will go for at least 10 years, maybe 12 years, I'll probably get 400 or 500,000 kilometers. Like the car itself is going to fail before the motor and
Yeah.
the battery do. Once the battery's done in the car, now you can actually take it out of the car. Let's say the car is totally pooched and it's the point where you're
Hmm.
like, yeah, the suspension's gone and there's problems with the chassis and you're like, okay, let's just, it's done. Let's say at 500,000 kilometers. You take the battery out and you've now got a battery that still has about 70% of its original range. So instead of
Hmm.
having 75 kilowatt hours of space in it, let's say it has around 58 kilowatt hours. It's still really useful. You can take 20 of those and put them inside a shipping container, and now you've got grid storage.
Interesting.
And for grid storage, it doesn't matter. Like it doesn't freaking matter because it's just sitting there. It can be
It's
as
just,
heavy
yeah.
and as so then you get another 10 years out of it as grid storage. And then when it's done, you can take all of those minerals and you can recycle it. And what they're finding now, so one of the, I think it's J.B. Straubel, who was one of the founders of Tesla. He's since branched off and created his own company that recycles lithium-ion batteries. They
Right.
can take all of those, the cobalt and the nickel and the lithium, and separate it out and then reuse it again, and it's a complete closed loop.
That's interesting.
So all this is something that people get, they get really up in arms, and they're like,
Yeah,
oh
they
yeah,
don't.
yeah, the mining. Once that stuff is mined, those batteries can be in a continuous loop. I mean, there's going to be small amount of waste, obviously, but nothing like what people are thinking.
Yeah.
Like the difference
Yeah.
is when you mine those fossil fuels, you take that stuff out and it's gone. It's into
It's
the
gone.
atmosphere.
Yeah.
There is no closed loop. There is no recycling that stuff. So
Yeah. There's
yeah.
got to be in the future where, so that we'll take the mining of the components for electric batteries.
Hmm.
And at some, like right now, it's using carbon to mine that. But I'm sure that they are using some electric vehicles for that. And it's getting better and better and better. And soon it will just be a complete, I don't know what you'd call it, like a system where it's
Yeah,
neutral,
and a
right?
fully electric ecosystem,
Yeah.
you
Yeah,
you could call it
exactly.
that. Yeah, and I mean, what's really interesting, this is really where it gets interesting, is that you make a really great case with your truck, and you go, hey, my truck really, my Explorer suits me, but if you want me to spend $120,000 for something that's the equivalent of electric, it's like, I'm sorry, I'm a homeowner, I'm a working guy, like it's too
Yeah.
much. The interesting thing is that in industry, and especially what we're seeing down in the States, because it's gotten a bit of a goose from the Biden administration and the whole IRA, the Inflation Reduction Act,
Yeah.
people who operate fleets, it's only about dollars, right? The
Yeah.
whole thing about logistics or the whole thing about operating a mining operation or anything in business is how can I do it faster and cheaper, right? And what they're finding now is that using electric transport and using electricity is way, way cheaper, right?
No doubt. Of course.
So we're going to see, we're getting into the electrification of things like in mining.
Yeah. Do you see
So it's
the
just a
problem
matter of
that I
time.
have with all of that stuff is
Mhm.
I don't claim to know all the details of stuff. I just
Sure.
hear things and have just kind of my thoughts.
Yeah, go ahead.
And it seems like in every single industry throughout the world, and we talked about the electric vehicle being available in the 1830s, I think you said.
Yep,
It's always
1832.
been industry and money that
Yep,
has either propped something up or pushed something down.
yep.
And it's kind of a shame that that's the case. So it feels like there is a way to create electricity without a lot of cost. And the pushback is, well, what about all the other people making the money on, oil or whatever else there is?
Yes, yeah.
You remove that, I think we could have a complete electric system there with no problem, and it'd be
100%.
free. I mean, I've heard Tesla created Nikolai Tesla created free energy. I don't know if that's true or not. I just, you see it on YouTube or whatever
Mm.
it is. It's the
Yeah,
pyramid. It's the gold thing on top of the pyramids. That's what it is,
yeah, yeah.
right?
I
I
mean,
don't
I
know if
think,
that's true, but it's could be, and I think that
yeah,
with technology we could figure something out. Like John, I heard
yeah.
that you can get electricity out of the air.
Yeah, I mean,
True? I don't
there's the
know.
classic sort of Newtonian thing of sort of, conservation of mass and conservation of energy, right? And energy doesn't just magically appear out of somewhere. It gets
Yeah,
transferred from one place to another, right?
true.
So the law of physics apply. It's just that what's really happening in the case of solar, for instance, is that there's a massive amount of solar power coming down all the time, and we just don't use it. So now it's a matter of how can we harness that.
Yeah.
And this is what I love about the whole idea of the green economy, and why I wouldn't say I'm super lefty. I'm a big believer in letting business, like my feeling is it's up to government to set the playing field. It's up to government to say, here's the rules of the monopoly game, and here's the get out of jail free card, and here's the chance card, and here's how it works, because this reflects the values of our society.
Hmm.
And then it's up to the rest of us to play and go, how am I going to win? Like, and if you set it up correctly, if you set it up in a really smart way, rather than saying, oh, people trying to do things for the lowest buck and trying to do it cheaply, isn't that terrible? Isn't it sad? And it's like, No, it's human. Like we
Yeah.
all want to try and get as much value for as little effort as possible.
Hmm.
We want to get as much good stuff for as little expenditure. Like that just makes sense. We've spent hundreds of thousands of years as like human beings on the planet playing it that way. And I think it's good for government to just kind of go, okay, how can we harness that natural desire, like in Norway, where you go,
Hmm.
okay, here's the rules. If you really want that Mercedes, it's not going to cost you 70,000, which is what it cost in Germany. It's going to cost you 95,000 here because of all the excise. And that Tesla over here, which is a little more pricey, instead of it being 100,000, we're going to take the excise off. It's going to be 80,000. So now you're comparing two very similar, a Mercedes S-Class and a Mercedes Model S, and a Tesla Model S, and this one is now 80,000. This one's 95,000. And someone
Yeah.
in Norway is like, yeah, well, of course I'm going to go for this one because it's cheaper and I like it a lot better, you know. And it just makes sense. Like that to me is the classic
Yeah.
thing. And really good green economics basically says there's a huge amount of waste. Like there is waste everywhere around us, right? An internal combustion engine is only about 32% efficient. So that means 68% of all that embedded energy that's sitting in your tank just gets blown off into the environment in the form of heat. And
Yeah.
green economics says, what if I could take that wasted 68%, and what if I figured out a way to capture that and I gave you 30%, and then I kept 30% for myself as my profit for
Yeah.
coming up with a cool business idea. You're still getting from A to Z or A to B or A to D
Hmm.
as easily as you ever were, maybe better. And we also don't have the waste, and I'm better off and you're better off because it's cheaper. Like,
Yeah.
and we can just keep looking. Like that to me is really exciting, to keep looking around us and keep going like really great engineers and going, where's the waste? Where's an opportunity to take something where you and I then we play a non-zero sum game,
Yeah.
right? Where it's not a case of you lose and I win or the other way around. It's like we're both winning here. We're taking something that's of no use to both of us, which is waste, and we're
Mhm.
turning it into value. And that's what an electric vehicle does. So instead of it being 32% efficient, it's like 95%
Yeah.
because it's super, super efficient.
And that's where we're at, with society too, is you mentioned it earlier too, is that there's a transition period where, you talked about Teslas being more expensive,
Hmm.
and the regular folks couldn't afford it. So the Ford government, put a kibosh to that.
Hmm.
But it's the same with energy. One of
Hmm.
the arguments that people use against EVs is that, oh, we're going to burn coal to supply the electricity for your electric vehicle.
Yeah,
That might
not
be
in
the
Canada.
case for a short period of time in any given place because you
Right,
have to get to the next level.
right.
What I see in the future, and I don't understand why it's not any quicker, is every house should have solar panels on the roof. They
Totally.
should have a built-in EV charger. The
Hmm.
house should be able to essentially run off of itself,
Yeah,
but not for much more cost. And the
no.
problem is right now that the cost to do that for whatever reason is so expensive. And in
Hmm.
fact, I think builders, this is just my opinion, I think builders put a premium on that because it's a cool thing. It's not necessarily because it costs a lot more. It probably
Hmm.
does. And again, if you get them in volume, it's not going to cost that much more. I just think it should be
Hmm.
standard. But
Yeah, and
everything
again,
these days is so expensive. So
yeah, I
what?
agree that. I mean, I think this is where, at some point, again, this is where the government comes in, and the cynical people would say you get the government you deserve, right? So the government is ultimately a reflection of our values, or you hope that it is. And if
Mhm.
you've got a good system, and this is one of the issues I have with first past the post, it's not really an accurate reflection. If we had proportional representation, it would be a very accurate reflection.
Mhm.
People could actually vote with their hearts and their minds,
Mhm.
as opposed to going, I better vote for this person because I don't want that other person. That's just
Yeah,
ridiculous.
yeah,
And
I
I
hear you.
also feel that if we had proportional representation, instead of being this crazy whipsaw swing between conservative government,
Yeah,
liberal government, conservative government, which neither of which fully represent the entire populace, if you had proportional representation, you would get small changes in
yes,
the political, which would actually represent the reality of Canadians' actual value
Yeah.
system. And those political entities would have to cooperate with each other. And you also wouldn't have this wholesale thing, like I said, of Ford kind of going, okay, everything that the Liberals were doing, we're going to burn it to the ground. We're going to take our
Yeah.
napalm guns. We're just going to flame it to the ground. You wouldn't do that because you would actually need to be cooperating with some of the other parties. You might be forming a coalition government with them. So you're not going
Yeah.
to burn bridges, right? And it seems like some of the most functional
Yeah.
zero proportional representation. So
It's so funny,
it's got a
John,
lot to do with that.
because you describe yourself as being left. I would just describe myself as being right. But
I
the
would say not
honest,
left is what I would say.
okay,
Yeah.
I would say that neither one of us have moved off of our position. It's everything else has moved away from us. The goalposts have moved. They've gone to the
Hmm.
far end of things. Like I believe that, in the conservative government, for some of the things that they do, balanced budgets and all that stuff, I don't think you should be giving away so much money. But I
Yeah.
also believe in being good stewards of the environment. I believe
Hmm.
in the rights of humans, no matter what
Yeah.
you believe. You know what
Yeah.
I mean?
Yeah.
And we just get, if we say we're on a certain political um, preference, we get
Yes.
pushed right to the other side. I'm an
Yeah.
extremist, right? And that is
Mm.
just a function of our society, social media. Everything has to be one or the other. It has to be black or white.
Yeah.
And it's a shame that we just can't actually, sit down and talk about the real issues. You know what I
100%.
mean? And
Yeah.
so, and the
It's
other
very
thing that just,
polarized. Yeah.
in terms of politics,
Hmm.
I've always thought this such a dumb system because what happens is the government comes in, like you said, they tear apart everything the previous government did. They
Hmm.
get maybe a year, we'll say, of stuff done. And then the next couple of years, they're just trying to hedge their bets because they have to get voted in again. So they
Hmm.
just say a bunch of nice, fluffy stuff that they think appeal to whatever crowd of the day. And you can look at that in the last federal election where
Yeah.
the conservatives didn't get the votes that they probably would have normally got because I forget I'm so bad at names. The politician that was the head of the Conservative Party
Hmm.
kind of flipped over to being a liberal. What he was saying was exactly what a liberal was saying
Aaron
at the time.
O'Toole, was it?
Yeah, yeah.
Yeah.
And so all the hardcore conservatives wouldn't vote for that. It was
Right.
just that's what he thought was going to get the votes at the time, and it backfired. You
Yep.
can't have that. You gotta, have your political party.
Hmm.
And I think that they have to go away from the extremes. It would be nice if we could come back to center a little bit,
Hmm.
whatever that was.
Yeah, yeah. I mean, we certainly seem to be, well, and I would say part of it is with the internet, it allows people to then occupy their own echo chamber, right? So you then
Absolutely.
read stuff and then it feeds you more and more of what you're already into so that everyone goes into their little echo chamber and it's self-reinforcing.
It's so
And
true.
it can certainly exacerbate
Yeah.
mentality and so
They
on.
should
Yeah.
change the algorithms because that's all built for
Yeah.
ads, right? They should
Yes.
change the algorithm for every one uh, regurgitated information or whatever they call
Hmm.
it, retargeting, I guess it's called.
Hmm.
You
Hmm.
have to have one of the opposite opinion. Wouldn't that be
Interesting.
great?
Well, and it would take again, you get the government you deserve, and you get the policies you deserve, and it really starts. And this is where it's interesting for me as an educator. It really starts with education, and it's no surprise. It's no surprise to me that, in my view, the countries that seem to be so far out in front, and we ultimately 30, 40 years later, we finally end up getting their policies anyway, because we kind of go, maybe we'll try that. Places like Norway, Sweden, Finland,
Mhm.
like the level of education and the value they put on education is extraordinarily high. And so as a result, you then get a populace who comes out and goes, okay, we get it. Like it really comes
Yeah.
down to your ability. It's actually your ability to make a bargain with a future version of yourself and say, I'm willing to forego maybe some things that I want immediately, like the cheapest and nastiest version of this and this, in exchange for putting some money in the bank account, if you will, for future gain. And I can
Yeah.
see, I can actually extrapolate. I can see where we're going. I can see the dots so far. Looks like this is where we're going. And I think we can agree as a society, this is where we're going because we've all had a really rich schooling experience. We all
Yeah.
get it, you know? And I think it's really, really sad, when you see governments as well, just yanking,
Yeah.
yanking the rug out from under the education system, you do that at your peril.
Yeah.
Because we need to have people who are well informed and well educated are going to make really good decisions. They're going to make future children.
Yeah.
That's honestly my
Yeah.
view.
I think we're headed in the right direction. We just had, I think, over the last, I'll say 5 years, but exacerbated through COVID, where we've
Hmm.
just had this turbulent period of time. But I think
Hmm.
that we're settling into the direction that we're supposed to be heading in.
Yeah.
And I think it's from people like yourself that are doing the education of people. Uh, I think everybody should take the time to think about how they live their life, the impact on the environment.
Hmm.
No matter what political view you have, it's still our
Yeah.
planet, and
Yeah.
you're not going to throw garbage on the side of the road. It's
Yeah.
one thing I love about Canada is that it doesn't happen too much. You go to some
Well, and
places in the US, it's bad.
you're young enough to not have you're a good bit younger than me, and you're young enough that you wouldn't have known that time. It was in the 70s. It was a thing. People literally would just hurl garbage out the window, and I can remember driving down to the States and seeing signs that said, it showed a tin can, and then it showed a gavel, and then
Yeah,
$200, and it's like
I
what?
remember that.
Yeah, but I mean, it was a thing. It was littered because people would just throw the stuff out, and we had a change. We had a societal change that because we kind of went, yeah, this is not sustainable. It's gross. I don't want
No,
to live
it's
with your garbage,
disgusting.
right?
Yeah,
And
absolutely.
and that worked because that was visible, right? You could see the results of people's actions. You could see them offloading, making a temporary, easy decision. I'd rather not have to go and collect the garbage from my car and walk 3 meters over to
Yeah,
or back then 3 yards over to a big can and put it in a garbage can, right? You just like, I just want to chuck it out the window. And then people went, this is ridiculous. Like, look, we
yeah,
can see the evidence around us. So pretty quickly, that change where it becomes challenging with things like CO2 is we can't see it. I mean, if you got
yeah. That's
enough of
right.
it in a room, you're going to be dead.
Yeah,
You'll know that it's there in that situation. But the whole idea of climate science and so on, uh, it's irrefutable from anyone who's actually a scientist. But for people who have a vested interest, there's the vested interest groups that are now being called out by the state of California and literally being treated like tobacco companies going, you knew, and we're actually going to take you to court, right? And you're smart enough and knowledgeable enough, and you were selling a story.
mhm.
You've also got a huge group of people who are just nice, good human beings who are upset by change, right?
Mhm.
They don't
Yeah,
mean anyone any harm, and they're not willfully being negative, but the idea of change is just upsetting to them, and I get that. I honor and I hear that, and those are the people who, if you look at the adoption curve, they're not the innovators for sure. They're not the early adopters. They're probably not the early majority. They're the late majority, or they're the laggards. They're the kind of
yeah,
like, it's all too much. It's moving too fast. I don't get it, and they want to be sure that things are okay. Like, I'm not going to buy an electric vehicle unless I'm like 100% sure that I'm in a sea of electric chargers, right?
yeah,
And I get that not everyone is wired to be invigorated by change or to be even okay with change. They're actually really upset by it. And I think it never comes out. Human beings don't have the wherewithal to go,
yeah,
oh, I'm just really upset by that change. They get angry and
yeah,
they start screaming and they start calling people names and they start stomping, right?
yeah.
Even,
Yeah,
even,
it's true. True. I think
mhm,
the one thing that would change all of that is the cost. It's no different than computers. I remember my first computer, which was slower than my phone by far, than my
mhm,
phone, floppy disk and all, was $1,000. I can
right?
still get a computer for $1,000 today. Isn't that
Yep.
crazy?
That's
And
Moore's
that
law.
that will be cars.
Yeah.
EV cars. I think it will get cheaper over
Yeah.
time, or at least stay
100%.
at this level.
Especially electric vehicles. And I wish I could remember the gentleman's name, but he's kind of an oracle with this stuff. It escapes me right now. Michael, no, not sure. And yeah, so he actually predicted the $15,000 US Chinese car. He said in 2023, there's going to be a $15,000. And people are like, you're crazy. It's like, it doesn't make any sense. And when you understand the way exponential growth works, it does make sense. But our brains, this is where it's interesting. Richard Dawkins talks about this. Our brains were evolved in middle world, not middle earth, like as in J.R.R. Tolkien, but middle world. Middle world is like I grab a rock and I throw it and I can predict in my own brain what that's going to look like. I throw a
Yeah.
spear, I know how that's going to go. That's Newtonian physics. We don't get things that are really small, which is like quantum level, and we don't get things that are ridiculously big like black holes, relativity.
Right.
They don't make any sense to our brain. So if you can like astral project out of your brain into those worlds, then all of a sudden you can dwell in that. You can utilize the knowledge of that for in a useful way. In the same way, we're seeing this where there's exponential growth happening in the electric vehicles, in the electrification of everything. There's reductions in the price of photovoltaics in batteries and so on. And this is why it's going to catch people by surprise, because it's not linear, and it's exciting. You know, it is, like as you were saying before, like we should be in a position where, I mean, we're not going to be able to pull electricity out of the air. There's still conservation of mass, conservation of electricity, but it's going to be pretty much as if that were the case, because efficiency will continue to pound us, and the cost will get driven down ridiculously low. Yeah.
Yeah, absolutely. John, we've been over an hour and we can probably
Oh my
go
God.
more than that. And we
Yeah.
only talked really pretty much about EVs, and we still have solar and all kinds of other stuff. So
Sure.
what I'd love to do is to, if you have time in the next couple of months,
Sure.
give it a little bit of break, and we'll have another conversation. And by then, maybe EVs will be even cheaper then. Who
I'd love it.
knows?
I
But
love
thank you
it.
for your time. I know you're a busy gentleman,
Yeah.
vast of knowledge, and I learned exponentially today. So I appreciate your time. Yeah, thanks, John.
Celebrating